Camping in. Written by Shilo Berry. Illustrated by Jenny Mount Stephen. Everything was ready for the big adventure that Lee and Chin Park had been planning for 3 weeks. The big adventure was that their mother had allowed them to camp in the backyard tonight. Mrs. Park had said that they could each have a friend over to camp with them. Mrs. Park had given Lee and Chin some money because they had washed her car. They had spent that money getting some food to cook on a campfire. But there was a problem, and it was a very big problem. The problem was that it had been raining for 3 whole days, and it didn't look like it was going to stop. "I hope it stops soon," said Lee's friend, Charlotte. "So do I," said Chen's friend, Emilio, as the 4 children looked out of the kitchen window at the raindrops splashing down. "We could always camp out in the yard next week," said Lee. "That would be no good for me," said Charlotte. "I'm going to my grandmother's." "Nor me," said Emilio. "My cousin's coming to stay with me." "Don't worry," said Mrs. Park, putting her head around the kitchen door. "You can still have your adventure. I have a plan. Come back at 5 o'clock with all your camping gear. Don't forget your sleeping bags, and bring a flashlight. It will be dark, remember." "What's the plan?" Chin asked his mother. "You'll see at 5 o'clock, replied Mrs. Park. "Now go and get your things ready." At 5 o'clock, the children were back in the kitchen. The raindrops were still splashing against the window. "Come on," said Mrs. Park, putting her head around the kitchen door again. "Let's go and get the campsite set up." "How can we set up the campsite when it's still raining?" asked Lee. "The rain doesn't matter," replied Mrs. Park. The children looked at each other but picked up all their camping things and followed Mrs. Park. She led them down the hallway to the big cupboard under the stairs. She opened the cupboard door. "You can camp in there," she said. Twee moved out all the junk that was in there and put in all my pot plants. "Now it looks like a good place for a campsite." "Wow," said Charlotte. "You're right, Mrs. Park. This does look like a good place for a campsite." "There are some rocks by the back door," said Mrs. Park. "Go and get them and you can use them for the campfire." "How can we have a fire inside?" asked Chin. "Get the rocks and then I'll show you," replied Mrs. Park. So the children quickly got the rocks from the back door. "Make a circle with them," said Mrs. Park. Then she scrunched up some red paper and put it into the middle of the rocks. "There's your fire," she said. "But you can't cook your supper on it. Mr. Park will cook the food you bought, but you can eat it here beside your campfire. Now, get your sleeping bag set up, and then you can sing some songs for the camp sing-along." "Camp sing-along?" said Emilio. "What's that?" "That's what you do when you're camping and you can't watch TV," replied Mrs. Park. "All of you know many songs, so it will be easy and a lot of fun." And the camp was a lot of fun. "I think it's more fun camping in than camping out," said Lee, just before they all fell asleep.